Awesome. So here we are. It is the 14th of December. This is how to plot a thing in, I swear to you, I promise, 4 steps. This has got some crunchy bits. If you're new to this, like totally new to me, totally new to these things, hi, it's nice to meet you. I would love for you to ask questions, like all the questions you have about how to do a thing or fix a thing or unfuck a thing or whatever a thing. I want you to benefit from this. My goal is to like make this make a difference for you. If you don't know who I am, I'm John. Hi. I'm a writing coach and developmental editor. I work with writers for the last 26 years, trying to help people get started, get going, and finish. So I want to help. Today we're going to talk plot. And the reason we're talking plot is because usually what I do is I grab a bunch of writers and we go around and around and around on some whatever they're writing. We'll go line by line, word by word. And it occurred to me early on that some of the basics of writing, plot being one of them, was really lacking to the point where, well, honestly, we needed to stop and regroup and address it rather than go back to pages and just, not make the kind of traction or make the kind of headway we could. So I figured if we spend a couple weeks walking through things, it might help. And that's how we got here. So on we go. We're going to try and answer what the hell a plot is. And plot is three things: plot is a conflict, plot is challenge, and plot is a question. Those are the three things to keep in mind. They're the three easiest ways to understand plot. I don't know how to tell you this politely, but some of you are writing a thing and you don't have a plot. You have a premise, you have an interesting bunch of scenes, but there's no plot. So we're gonna build you a plot. Part number one: plot is conflict. And it's a conflict that asks or challenges the question: why is the status quo of the world, we'll talk about that in a second, why is the status quo of the world no longer able to be maintained? Now, when I say the world, I don't mean like the big giant picture of the planet and the universe and the continents and the kingdoms and the whole land. I don't mean that. I mean the world of the character. Like, for your main character, why can't their status quo be maintained? For the adventuring party in your fantasy novel, why can't the status quo be maintained? Think about it on the individual level rather than the group level, and you will understand the conflict of things as making or create a conflict that is far more relatable. Because if you just tell a random person in 2025, hey, these two kingdoms are at war, they don't care as much as if you say something like, this person has been displaced from their home and they're wondering how they're going to go and survive in a new place where they know nothing and have nothing. It's a lot more relatable when you think about it in terms of conflict rather than accomplishment. But also, plot is a challenge. Plot is a challenge because, and this is a significantly lacking thing for a lot of story, the characters don't work very hard. They're not challenged. And most significantly, they're not changed by what they have to do. They just go through the story like it's no big deal. Oh, it's a Tuesday. I just happen to, save all of existence, but no big deal. I'll see you on Wednesday and we'll have donuts or something. When a character goes through a plot, whatever plot it might be, the character has to be both challenged and changed by the events of it. Doing the plot means they are not the same person after it is done as they were when it started. And I don't just mean like they're technically older because time passed. I mean like the doing of the plot cost them something, changed something, challenged something, poked something in their internal composition, left them changed in some way, whether that's, now I have a robot arm, or whether that's something more like I can no longer go back to my life of luxury now that I have seen the inequality of existence. There's some kind of change going on. It should just not be ho hum. It's just another day in the week. Make it matter. Plot should be difficult. We want difficult because we want to root for the character to see if they succeed. There's nothing wrong with difficulty. Plot is also a question. If you can turn your plot into a question, you will find a really easy way of sort of like double checking all the bits to make sure that it has tension, that it has risk, that it has stakes, that it has all the stuff a plot should have. But you got to be able to frame it as a question. And just so we're clear, when I say plot, I am not only talking about the main plot, the A plot, the primary plot of the book. Everything is like, so character arcs, romantic subplots, any subplot, all those things are plots. They're just plots of different sizes. The main plot is an A plot. All the other plots are B plots. That includes character arcs. Those are plots too. So when I say plot, I mean all of these things. If you can frame it as a question, you get a better way of understanding exactly what it is that's going to happen. Can I give an example of phrasing the plot as a question? Sure. Can the team of scrappy underdog sports people learn to work together and win the big championship? Can a kid from New Jersey who's been bullied learn karate from a janitor and crane kick the blonde jock kid in the face? Or if you don't want to phrase it as a can, you can phrase it as a would. What would happen if you gave what would happen if you gave infinite power to, can Simba become a king is a good one. We used that one when we were talking about character development. The general idea of can or would or why or what if or how, framing it as a question lets you see the size of it, lets you see the scope of it. We know that if Simba is going to become king, we know we're not also talking about like the fish in the sea way over there, because they're not part of the story. Can Erwin come to terms with the changes that are happening to him? We know that we're going to deal with Erwin and changes and whether or not he can deal with it. You're framing your plot as a question matters. And if your question ends up being somewhat overly simplistic, can a guy survive a day at work? That's not bad, but if there's not if it's just a matter of like we just have to pass time and turn the page and maybe make coffee and maybe photocopy things, like there's no real engagement there. But framing it as a question lets us at least evaluate that. We want to make sure it is a question asked of the characters, not just what happens when bad guys shoot good guy. We want to do better than a broad jackass question. On we go. So how do we do this? Step number 1 of 4, we identify sources of conflict. Now, conflict is the interaction between two things that can't coexist. There's a level of volatility there. Two things rubbing up against each other that generally should not. We don't get along. Conflict plus tension. Tension is the uncertainty, that unease, that uncomfortable feeling that goes along with conflict, because tension is sort of the force that pushes and pulls and repels and bounces these things off each other. Conflict plus tension equals plot. And this is true for main plot, subplot, character arc, flashback, secondary plot, tertiary plot, all that stuff. Conflict plus tension. In your own work, you should be able to identify the conflict and the sources of tension. There should be at least one each for every plot. Well, we'll get there. It's important to remember that story lives in imbalance, and you've got to think about this as though it is a bottle of soda shaken up, because something is going to set it off. Ideally, the doing of the story itself is the thing that sets it off, but this bottle of soda is going to burst. And your job is to think about who benefits or loses when it does or if it does. When being more important than if. but you want to think about your plot, whatever it is, in terms of its tension, in terms of its danger, in terms of its conflict, in terms of its challenge, in terms of the things people will have to do to win, or I'm making air quotes, or fix, or overcome, or something like that. It is not just about, hey, look, somebody's doing something and somebody else is doing something back. It's more than that. It's much more complicated than that. It needs to be more complicated than that. Story exists when you find things out of balance, because balance on its face can be dull. That is different than, say, temporary balance, where things are carefully, like in a Cold War. Mufasa dying and Scar taking over the power vacuum. Yeah, that's an imbalance, because it is a huge shift for, like, the whole, wherever the light touches. It's a whole big thing. Yeah, that's good. So what do? We make a list. I'm a big fan of lists. I think lists are a really functional, practical, actual way of sorting out your plot. So we're going to make a list of sources of conflict. What kind of power balances, what kind of tensions, what kind of things can we set off against each other? And I'm making these binary because it's easiest, because it's just an easy example. But you could have, 1 on 1 on 1, 4 on, 2 on 1, 4 on 1, 4 on 2. You could have whatever kinds of imbalances and whatever number of teams, for lack of a better word, on each side. But you're going to have sources, and there's going to be conflicts because of those sources. So in a peasants versus nobility story for high fantasy, generally you're going to have your conflict being one group has plenty and one group doesn't. In the typical rebel empire, rebel monarchy story, your conflict is the galaxy needs to be freed because usually the monarchy or the empire is bad. If you look at a sports story, you get like there's only one, there can be only one, whether that's Highlander rules or just championship of sport rules, where the very clear action is there can be only one winner. There's only one championship to win. But there's also in sports stories like a self-doubt story. Am I good enough to do a thing? And that way your competition is character versus their own doubt or their own fear. And temptation or resistance, can I give in? Will Frodo give into the ring? Will Frodo be able to resist the ring? Those are not obviously the only conflicts that exist in the world, obviously, but thinking about your sources and its conflicts can give you a base to sort out what your story has or what your story needs. Because if you don't have conflict, there's nothing really for the characters to do other than take up space and just occupy, which is not generally compelling. And we want compelling. We like compelling. Now we're on step 2. Now we're going to take this and we're going to go up a level and we're going to find stakes. Stakes are the risks and rewards. They are the best and worst case things that could happen if we resolve the plot. And resolving the plot is finishing it doing the thing it wants to do. And the reason we framed everything as a binary was because clearly in a binary, it's a lot easier to say one side wants the best case and one side wants the worst case, but each side thinks its side is the best case. And each side thinks the other side is the worst case. So your stakes are what's really being, what's at heart here? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to get? What is our desired outcome? And it's the wanting or not wanting something to happen that's making characters do the thing they want to do. Because you're saying this thing they want, whatever it is, has to be important to them. Nobody sits down to write an unimportant story. Nobody sits down to write an unengaging plot on purpose. The characters want something. They have a goal. We talked about that last week when we talked about characters. That drive to get that goal is what keeps them making the decisions and doing the actions and surviving the stuff of the plot. And it's all for stakes. Stakes and goals drive characters. So how do you find the stakes? You ask 3 questions. What's the worst that could happen? Every character has a view in the story as to what's the worst that could happen relative to the plot, whether it's the romance subplot, the worst that could happen, oh, they leave me. Or the worst that could happen, oh, the evil wizard takes over the kingdom or whatever. We also flip that question around. What's the best that could happen? Oh, they fall madly in love with me and I'm with them forever. Or the wizard doesn't take over the kingdom and we all get to live in peace and have nachos, whatever. The third part of this is who wants the bad thing, because every character is going to consider some outcome bad, and they're not all going to be the same and they're not all going to agree on it. But who wants the bad thing to happen, and why do they want it to happen? Bob and Tom think that, Kevin wants the promotion at work and it's just the worst ever because Kevin's an asshole and Kevin wants to, climb the corporate ladder and just ruin the company. Your character's perspective on what the bad thing is and who wants it says a lot about the relatability of your plot. Aiden wants to bring the refugees out of the war zone, else they will die. Fantastic stakes. We don't want the refugees to die. Cool. We have to do this. Urgency. Yay. You want to avoid low impact stakes that are just kind of indifferent or stakes that are just kind of there. And that's usually a lack of challenge or a lack of urgency. Because when our stakes are just kind of there, our story drags on and on and on and on and on and on before it really gets a sense that anything is happening. Stuff's happening. People are doing things. We can look at verbs in sentences. But narratively, what are we really accomplishing? Again, this is why something like exposition becomes so critical, because it gives us that framework to understand when one event starts and one event ends and how things move from event to event. But we will talk about that in way more detail when we cover beats and scenes, but that's not today. On we go. So now we're going to go back to our list. We had sources, we had conflicts. Now we're going to add stakes. So if we grab two of our things, Rebels versus Empire in a fantasy story or sci-fi story or a space opera or whatever, the question really becomes one of freedom or fascism. And then what happens? What are the stakes? Well, if the Empire wins, bad things happen. And if the good guys win, good things happen. I picked the most elementary way to say that, but that's the idea. We want to tie your stakes to the conflict. You don't want to tie your stakes to your sources because it's kind of baked in there. But if we tie our stakes to our conflict, then we have lots of different ways of resolving that conflict. So if our tension issue or source is A loving B, the easiest conflict in a two-person romance is can they get over their respective problems? Can they get over their respective issues to make it work or not? And the stakes are very clear cut. It's either going to work or it's not. And that's enough compelling tension because both characters are motivated to be part of this relationship or not. And, like one of my ongoing struggles in this world is to make Jell-O. I get impatient and I don't wait long enough, so it doesn't really gel. But it feels like a personal failing on my part. Like I'm not good enough to make Jell-O. Like there's something lacking in my character. So that's the conflict with it. I've never gotten the ice cream method to work, but that's neither here nor there. But the stakes are either I have Jell-O and I feel like I've won something or not. But it's important to think about the stakes in terms of the conflict. Why is it a big deal? Why is it urgent? Why are we not going faster? Why is it not already done? Why is it not simpler? Why is it not harder? Think through all these things. Your job is to connect the dots, not for the reader. Your job is to offer the dots and a little bit of momentum, a kind of kick in the ass, so that the reader can connect them too. But you don't have to try so hard to be clever or stand out or whatever horse shit they tell you when you Google writing advice. Don't be over clever. The story will be plenty compelling, plenty engaging, very interesting if you tie your stakes to your conflict. And then everything else comes down to just how you write it. The words you choose, the length of your sentences, the number of paragraphs, how many scenes, in what order are they? All things under your control to cover things like pacing and engagement and all that stuff. But this is just plot building. This is just building a formula for a story that has a conflict at the center of it that somebody's going to do something about. On to step 3. We are nearly done. We are rocking and rolling along here. We're going to map the course of the story. Hooray, writing. So we're going to make a map. We're going to take our plot, state it as a question. Remember, we did that way back at the beginning. We're going to state it as a question so that it can reveal to us the things we need. So if we take, can Simba be king? We know we need certain things in order to get there. We need to have a scene where there's already a king and there's already a Simba where Simba is not king. We know we need a scene where Simba can become, we need a reason for Simba to become king. So we got to get rid of the old king. We know that we need a scene where Simba has the ability to become king. And we need a scene with a reason for Simba to be king or not be king. And then ultimately we need a scene where Simba becomes king. Your job, once you frame your plot as a question, is to ask how many scenes are necessary to answer this question. Your bare minimum should be 3. A beginning, a climax, and an end. Remember, we're not just talking main plot here. We're talking about romance arcs and subplots and interpersonal investigatory arcs and the murder mystery and the, oh, by the way, what about the zombies? All those things. Beginnings, climaxes, and ends are the barest minimum. Ideally, though, you want 5, not 3. Because you need a beginning, a climax, a beginning, development, an end, climax, and a resolution. 5 for everything. All the plots. Not a scene, not a sentence, not a paragraph, a scene, not just a breeze. And you count how many you have, and we start outlining and framing the story based on the requirements we have, seeing the plot as a question. How many subplots are too many? Yes. It's a function. So there are a number of ways of figuring out how many subplots are too many. Yeah, I'll send you part 4 afterwards. Yeah, it's no problem. How many subplots are too many? Generally, you want to take your total number of protagonists and divide by 2. And that's usually the rough way of saying I can have this many subplots in my plot. So if you have 3 main characters, you have 1.5-ish subplot potentials. How would you translate the 5 things to a web novel? They don't translate. Okay, hang on, hold up. A web novel is just a novel that you're posting one bit at a time. It follows all the same rules. So you still need a beginning, a climax, a beginning, a development, a climax, an end scene, and a resolution. You need all those pieces. It just happens that you are publishing it in a different way than if you were just making a single manuscript. Like, you're still making a manuscript. It's just not a book. It's a web novel. So it's different web pages. But it's the same thing. You still need them. So for instance, we have an example later, but if you have a main plot, you've got a beginning, a development, a middle, a climax, and an end. You have all those pieces. They turn into chapters, multiple chapters sometimes. Not just paragraphs, not just sentences, whole last chapters, multiple chapters. It's not unreasonable to have a climax be 2 to 4 chapters, or to have, a chapter dedicated to one piece of development in a romance relationship. Thousands of words, hundreds of words, some amount of words. But if you're drawing it, if you've got multiple things, they're each individuated, right? So you've got your main plot, that's one arc, one trajectory, but you've also got your character arc, that's a second trajectory. Then you've got a subplot, that's a third trajectory. And they're all woven together. You don't always have to invest every single one of them in every chapter, because 1, that's going to make it a mess to read, and 2, it's just a lot of work, and 3, it's going to make it sound like you don't know what you're doing. But you want to make sure that in a chapter, whatever that chapter is, you've got the scenes that are advancing something. Is this a main plot chapter? Is this a subplot chapter? Is this a character arc chapter? And then it is what the chapter is. Oh, this is the main plot chapter. Cool. This is a romance subplot chapter. Cool. And then we go to the next chapter and we pick up a different thread, or maybe we carry the same thread and we just keep going. The web novel part of this is just a publishing decision, not a narrative one. Don't think about it as being something extra, because it's not. The web novel part is just how you are distributing the story to readership. It's a great question. On we go. So now we have these pieces, right? So we see this question. We know we've got these 5 pieces, maybe more. How do we space them apart? How do we know where they go? Well, we know the beginning ones have to go at the beginning and the end ones go near the end, but the beginning and end of what? Because they can't just be wherever. You can't just do them out of order because it won't make sense. So you got to figure out your pacing. Now, this is trial and error. There is no exact science here. And people hate that answer, but I don't have a better one for you. You have to learn to develop the gut sense of this pacing makes sense for me. This order of things makes sense to me. And it isn't just a matter of it's this way because I said so. It's because okay, if I'm doing a murder mystery, before I find the murder weapon, I got to show the footprints because the murder weapon is a more important clue. So it comes later when you're already invested in the story. That's a decision you're making. Everybody's got a trial and error process. You can make that easier on yourself by organizing in advance, but it's still fussy. It's still imperfect. That's the part people get frustrated about because sometimes you write it and it isn't working. You got to try shuffle the pieces around and try again. But there is what's going to be a best fit spacing for these events in your plot, whatever they might be. When we get to the example, this will make more sense. Here now is where we talk about 3-act structure. Chances are, this will make sense in a second. Chances are most of you are writing in 3 acts. Most of you. I think one of you is doing 7, but that's not really important right now. 3 acts is just fine. 3 acts will get you everywhere you need to go. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The vast majority of stuff in your book will be in Act 2. Act 2 is the biggest. But 3 acts are an easy thing to understand, beginning, middle, end. Your first act is introductory. We learned some stuff. This picture is not the best picture I could have used. The first act introduces things, and the first act ends. What if you prologue into Act 2? I throw it back at you and tell you to do it again. Don't prologue into your second act. That makes my brain leak out of my ears. The point is, Act 1 ends when the plot begins. So that if you're already doing plot, you're out of Act 1. That's why we don't start plot in like the first 5 pages. That's why we don't start plot right away. Because it's not a race and the story isn't only like 3 pages long. You don't have to rush right to it. First act, introduction. We learn things. It ends when the plot begins, and that begins Act 2, where things develop. We gain more information. We learn about characters. We learn about stuff. And Act 2 builds, and we gain information, and we gather stuff all the way up to the climax. When the climax starts, Act 2 ends. The climax is its own thing. Now, in the course of Act 2, before we get to the main plot climax, in the course of Act 2, you've probably resolved a good percentage of, if not all of, your subplot and your character arc. Because the climax is the highest point of tension in a story. And I would love to weave all the tension and all the stressful stuff and all the hardcore stuff through the climax. But if I can't, I try to wrap it up before I get there. So we have a climax, the highest point of tension, where we resolve, at the very least, the main plot of the book. Then, after that, we resolve. We move to the denouement, and we resolve. Then we end. 3 acts. The vast majority of your stuff lives in the second act. So your main plot begins at the end of Act One, is everywhere in Act Two, includes goes through the climax, and is involved in the resolution. That's the bulk of the book. It's supposed to be. Your subplot, whether that's your romance subplot or whether that's what are my five friends doing, just when the main story isn't moving, it's anywhere in Act Two, maybe the climax, maybe the resolution. The character arc, the way the character grows and is transformed over time. Maybe it starts in Act One, but it most definitely is everywhere in Act Two, the climax and the resolution. Are you seeing the pattern? We want to try and make sure that the majority of our development is in Act Two. So here comes the big example. Let's say we're doing a murder mystery. And our amateur detective, our main plot is they find the body. Oh, look, it's a body. They investigate the murder. They find out it was done by a killer. Then they eventually chase the killer down and stop the killer. That's a main plot. Nice and easy. It can't just be that though. We got to give more. We got to give them more to do. We have to write, 80,000 words. So let's give them a subplot. Great. They have a subplot. Their subplot can be something mundane because whatever. So we're going to fix the front porch. The steps need, new concrete. We should put a railing in or something. I don't know. We should fix the front porch. But we should also add some challenge. Remember, we talked about challenge way back. The challenge of things. We're going to make an earthquake happen. Why? Because it sounds exciting. So there's going to be an earthquake. And following the devastation of the earthquake, the rest of the subplot is fixing up the rest of the house. But that's not all this story is, because we also have a character arc. And we should have a character arc separate from a subplot and separate from the main plot. Yeah, we're taking a big swing here. Our character arc. Let's suppose our main character has a daughter. Sure, why not? So at the beginning of our story, somewhere, our main character left a message for their daughter. Hey, how you doing? We should hook up, have some lunch, hang out, catch up, that kind of thing. And eventually they meet the daughter. And we start that relationship and they reconnect. But ultimately we need conflict. We need a crisis in this. So what do? We argue with them. Our main character argues with the daughter for whatever reason. But ultimately we need them to reconcile. Now, how do we weave all these pieces together? Like this. And it's because of the earthquake. The earthquake is a big environmental tension point, and it's going to throw the rest of the story kind of for a loop. So we're going to act with it. So if in the course of investigating, so here's how our story would begin if we're going to do all the pieces. We introduce our main character. We discover that, here's their life. This is what they're trying to do. They decide they need to fix their porch because it's a mess. So they start doing that. Along the way, they stop and call their daughter to make plans to meet up. Then in the course of things, while they're doing that, they discover the body and it sets them on a course to investigate. While they are investigating, they are meeting up with their daughter and trying to, get that relationship repaired while also trying to, remember to fix the porch and everything and chase this killer down. And things build and things build and things build until they realize that they have to go stop this killer. They're the only one who can. We talked about that last week when we talked about characters. So they have to chase this killer down. They're the only one who can stop them. But this is the moment where in order to do that, they argue with their daughter. Their daughter doesn't want them to go hunt the killer down. But this is when the earthquake happens. Oh no, the earthquake. The daughter is, lost in the earthquake area. The killer is on the loose. The earth is literally buckling and shaking. Oh man, what are we going to do? And it's during this earthquake, the climax of our story, where we chase the killer and catch the killer. Hooray, we've saved the day. No more killings. Except now the earthquake has left other problems. The house has been destroyed and we have to reconcile with our daughter. And our book ends with realizing just how devastated the house is, but we also get a chance to make it up with our daughter. That is how you tie all these pieces together. But we can only do that if we take everything down to its pieces. And the only way we can do that is by sitting here and mapping them all out in advance and figuring out where to connect which dots in what order. Which leads us to step 4, the final step of our 4-step process: signposts and anchors. We know we have to have the following scenes. We know there's going to be a climax. We know there's going to be an intro. We know there's going to be development. We know there's going to be resolution. We have to have these things. There's no way around it. So just write them out of order as we think of them. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just needs to be down. Get it on the page. So we treat these sort of foundational things, required things, they're anchors because they hold the story together. You can't have an arc if it doesn't start. You can't have an arc if it doesn't resolve, because it's just a thing then. You can't have if it doesn't have a climax, there's no real point to it. If it doesn't develop, it doesn't feel like it really matters. You need these things. Anchors matter. So you write your anchors first. But it can't just be anchors, right? There has to be this extra layer to it. So we have signposts. Signposts are scenes that give us a trajectory, that point us in a way. Hey, go this way. The story's going this way if you're looking for this thing. Just like a sign on a road tells us how far from a destination we are. And signposts are any indicator of a possible vector or trajectory for story. So the example I give for this would be, let's say you have a dream sequence or a flashback that we chop into pieces and we put at the beginning of every chapter, because the sum total of all those flashbacks or all the pieces of the dream sequence together tell a complete picture. All those little blurbs, whether they are a paragraph, a page, a half chapter, whatever, all those things are signposts. They indicate to us, oh, part of the story is going in this direction. The scene where you flash back to reveal that the killer has been, the former disgruntled employee this whole time is part of the story that signposts things going in a certain direction. It makes a substantial difference when we think about how anchors can give us grounding and signposts give us mood and atmosphere. Because a plot isn't just this event to this event to this event to this event. It's part of the whole story triangle. It's part of the whole thing that builds the story itself. The plot is what the characters are doing in the world, driven by the goals, skills, and things that they are. We talked about that last week when we talked about characters. So let's recap this thing. And then I want questions if you have them. So 3-act structure is our friend. We love 3 acts. And most of the stuff you're going to write lives in the 2nd act. The better organized we can be, the better off we are. We use anchors to set us up to coordinate and connect things. And we use signposts to add depth to it. All your plots, all of them, are about conflict. Something between something else, something internal, something external, something environmental, something. All plots are about conflict. Conflict between people and their individual goals creates tension that keeps the story engaging. And it should not be over easily or quickly. Rushing through these things, whether it's I'm going to make these 2 guys fall in love, or I'm going to go learn that I have magic powers because I'm a wizard. It should not be easy and it should not be quick, because it's an important story thing. If it's so easy and so quick, why didn't you just start the story with it already? The majority of the plots, subplots, character plots, arcs, all that stuff, live in the 2nd act and go through the climax. And here's your tease for the next thing we'll talk about. Plots are made out of scenes and beats. We will talk scene construction and we will talk beats next Saturday. But for now, it's important to remember that your plot can be framed as a question and broken into conflicts and possible outcomes and the people and the things involved in that, and about creating that tension between them. So, who has questions about anything? Doesn't have to be about plot. It could be about anything. How do I do this? What about this? Why doesn't this work? How does this fit with whatever question you got?
So, I'd actually like to expand on the earlier question.
Sure.
Um, so one of the things I'm going to just kind of preface this with for you or anyone else who doesn't know, a lot of web
Mhm.
novels tend to have seasons to them, which I personally think kind of breaks down into this would be a new book in a series.
Season
Um,
season like TV show season?
yeah, kind of like that because that's what it tends to be called, either seasons or volumes,
Okay.
and they happen every so often. Um, And so and this is why web novels are sometimes like 400 chapters long because it's actually like, 6 seasons or 7 seasons.
Right.
So when a season is done should be when one plot,
One
major
main
plot
plot.
thing is done, right? One
Correct.
3 act plot.
Yeah, you would treat this the publishing version of this would be it's a book in a series, and a season is a book. You could also borrow it from television, and every season has a style guide and and a storybook, and it goes through, and that's the book for the season where you break it into pieces. So yes, it's just that your season would still contain all those parts.
Okay, thank you very much.
You got it anytime. All right, so I had some questions here. Hang on. So if most stuff happens in Act Two, does that mean Act One is shorter? Yes. Act One and Act Three are roughly, I'm making broad hands, roughly the same size, and they are both combined shorter than Act Two. This might sound dumb, but how do I tell where my acts end? That's not dumb. That's awesome. All right, so here's where your acts end. Your first act ends when the next thing that would happen would be the start of the plot. So if we're doing the classic example I always give is the murder mystery, right? The cop drama, the procedural, that kind of thing, where when the next thing we would do is start to investigate the crime, we've ended act one because the next thing is going to be the plot. So act one ends when the plot starts. Act two ends when the next thing that would happen would be the climax of the story. The climax ends when it resolves the plot. That's Holmes wrestling Moriarty off the mountain. That's Khan and Kirk getting into a ship fight. When the when Spock dies, like when the conflict of the story is done, the climax is done, and when then from the minute the climax is done, the resolution starts. Third act, and the third act is done when the book's done. That's the easy one. Have I heard of the four act structure? Yes, I am familiar. I can never pronounce the word, but yes, I'm familiar with four act structure. It does not rely on conflict. It relies on inter-character development and pacing. I don't teach four act. I can. I don't. I mean, it's good. It works. It can be hard to do. A lot of people take a stab at it and realize they're just making three acts. They never really break it into four, but yeah, it's a thing. It does not rely on conflict. That doesn't make it wrong or anything. It's just it doesn't rely on conflict. So yeah, the season thing. If you're going to go with seasons, which you shouldn't, but okay, let's assume it's part of a bigger cultural picture. If you're going to go with seasons, every season is a book. It's one of those web novel things where it like the fish swimming upstream, right? So we're all going one direction. Publishing works like this. This is how you're going to grow your audience. This is how you're going to make, $3.99 a book. Do it this way. And then here comes something else that's just seasons. Well, okay, then it's not really seasons like television shows because television shows have individual scripts that are paced out and overall season arcs, which are different. But I get where you're going. Seasons and web novels are also parts of a volume. Well, that's just fucking dumb. I know you didn't invent that, but that's a mistake because now you're just complicating more things. Now you get seasons and parts and volumes. You're just making it harder on yourselves. Just individuate your story, break it into pieces. What does a good closing line in a book look like? Examples would be cool. Shit. Off the top of my head, pizza? Man. Generally, your closing line of a total book should be more than something pat, right? Like it shouldn't just be, And that was a good day. Like, that's obnoxious. Don't be obnoxious about it. It's mainly for the season to take part in season part completion breaks. Well, just stop writing. Like, just take a break. But that's neither here nor there. I want to go back to this closing line. The decision is normally made in closing lines between the idea of I want to tie this thing off and make a point. Like, golly gee, that was a good day. We all learned the value of $1 that day. Or usually 9 times out of 10, you want either hopeful or dismissive as an ending. Hopeful being like, and then we sat on the porch looking at the sunset, wondering what tomorrow would be. Or dismissive of like, they watched the Millennium Falcon fly away knowing they would have to go rescue Han Solo. A closing line suggests mood for what would come next, even though there is no additional book. So introducing about the war. Oh man, if we're going about the war, you could do it in Act 1, but once we're really getting into it, that's Act 2. So in that case, it depends on the specific part you are writing and how you are writing it. And that's how we save the day, or did we? There we go. Is both, if we just stopped it and that's how we saved the day, kids, like that's obnoxious. We can do better. But if we add the or did we, then it becomes something compelling. But again, even that is sometimes too on the nose. If you have a whole series of books, should you have your plot for the whole thing or tackle one book at a time? Okay, great question. Ideally, you're doing one book at a time because the plot of your whole series is done in pieces over the course of each book. So if you have 5 books in a series, I'm going to make numbers up to explain this. If you have 5 books in a series, 20% of your series plot is handled in a book, in addition to each book having 100% of its own plot. So if you have 3 books, each book is its own plot individually by itself, but also it is 33% of the larger, greater series plot. And yes, the same would be true of seasons. And yes, the same would be true of long form anthology, not short form anthology. But yeah, if you have percentages of a whole, each piece is individuated. Each piece stands on its own because a reader might not read the whole thing. They might get book 2 at the used bookstore and not read book 1 in order. That's not their fault. That's just what they had access to. Now, in terms of writing the thing out, you should map the whole thing and then figure out how you're going. You specifically, Blue, map the whole thing and divide it into books because it'll teach you how to make decisions. It'll teach you how to organize your idea. What's the advantage of separating a book into 3 acts while writing? Especially because act structure gives us the whole point of act structure is to give it structure. Like, we separate the book into acts to create a sense of anticipation and move the story forward. The whole point of a first act is setup so that we dispense with some of that in advance to go get the to get into the second act. So the advantage of separating it into acts is to help organize and lay out the story. If you just jumped right into Act 2 with no development, the reader would be off balance and completely organized, lacking information to figure out who the hell the character is, what's going on, and where the world is. The reason you have an Act 1 is to set up some of the stuff that the story is going to take place in. So we can learn about the character, so we can get on board with the story, so that we can learn the vibe, so that we can relate to the character and not just see the events of a story play out. Because the most elementary way of handling this is here's the action. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, which is fine. It's okay. Like, it's not the end of the world, but it's a really simplistic and under nuanced way of writing. The reason we have acts is because each act, first, second, climax, and third, carries with it a level of anticipation and engagement. The reason the climax is where the climax is because we spent the whole second act building up to it. And that makes the climax a big deal and we want to see how it goes. And the third act ends the way that it does because it wraps up the whole thing. So the advantage of organizing a story into 3 acts is to build a more effective story. If you don't intro in the beginning, we don't really get to develop anything because you didn't set anything up. It's sort of like if you told me about your day, like if you told me what you did yesterday and you told me the pieces out of order, I'd be confused and it would be hard to follow your story. Act one makes the promise the resolution will deliver on. Yeah. The naming convention is confusing. That is interesting. I didn't make the naming convention. It's is old. It's English. No, no. First act is set up. Plus the climax. Yeah. 3 acts and a climax. It's really 4 parts. Climax, top of the mountain. Sometimes it's called the zenith, the high point of story. Every story ends. What if you have a story that never ends? Then you failed. Like you missed the boat. Every story has an endpoint. That's different than I don't want my story to end, but every story should have an end because you won't get the reception not just the reception in terms of like commercial transaction from audience, but like you've been building and building and building this emotional experience, right? Like you've been prompting and cueing the reader to celebrate a win and overcome bad guys or whatever else. If that never ends, you're denying the reader that satisfaction. That's why stories progress. If your story never ends, what the fuck are you doing? What's the point? What are you doing? Everything. It becomes more like a soap opera at that point, which is fine. There's nothing. I mean, the world needs Days of Our Lives and General Hospital all we want, but there's a reason why those things are scripted. Those things are formed in seasons. Those things are formed with definite endpoints. Everything has an endpoint. In a romance novel, is Act Two where the romance starts? Yes. Meaning no romance in Act One, no substantial romance in Act One. Like you can have the character go on like a bad date, but it can't go anywhere. Or you could, depending on the story, you could break somebody up in Act One and then have Act Two them like getting over it and going and doing things. But no serious the word is substantial. No substantial romance in Act One. No, the bulk of a romance in a romance novel is in Act Two. Just like plot, because it is a plot. Good question. Stories that never end are milk. Yes. But those aren't the stories that stick with us. 2 season and it ends because summer ends. Yeah, Gravity Falls is a good example of that. Web serial that has 13 million words. That's nice. I have about 18 pairs of socks in the other room. You got to learn how to end things. You have to learn how to end things. If you are ever going to get past writing on the internet for no money, like if you're ever going to make that conversion to like print or publication digitally or whatever, then like you gotta you gotta get past some of that. You gotta learn how to end things. What kind of subplot can you have in Act One? Can't really do a whole. You cannot do a well. You should not do a whole subplot in Act One. Act One is a start, right? Act One is the beginning of things. You can begin a subplot in Act One, but you can't have a whole subplot in Act One because if because the story hasn't really started then. It's sort of like the opening minutes, or it's the first moments of a thing. You can't if because the question narratively and editorially is going to be if this starts before the rest of the story starts, why didn't we just start with it in the first place? So generally, no, you can't subplot in Act One. You can start some subplots. You can introduce some problems. that the rest of the story will later develop. You can introduce that your character has insomnia because insomnia is the subplot that you will, deal with over the rest of the book. And then your second act for insomnia subplot could be the character struggling with it and dealing with it or whatever. And then because of the climax or because of the rest of the plotting in the story or whatever, the resolution of the insomnia subplot is in the third act of the overall book, the last third of the book, where they finally sleep well. But you could not do start, beginning, and end a whole subplot at the beginning in Act One. It's too early in the book. It's a good question. What's next? Some tensions remain unresolved. Can an ending be satisfying? Yeah, because unresolved tension. Oh man, if as long as some tensions are resolved, you can still get some amount of satisfaction out of an ending. So if we have, for instance, escaped our captors, but we know we have to go back and rescue other people, or we know that um, we survived the tornado, but we know we have to go back and try and rescue our friends. Some things can be unresolved, but the things that have been resolved will give us some amount of satisfaction. And then other resolutions can be hanging out pending for future books. As long as you're ending something, you're going to get some amount of satisfaction. You can't, you definitely, I need to make, hang on, where's my button? You need to like absolutely, positively, definitely make sure that in a book, even if it's a book in a series, you got to resolve something. You can't just constantly keep kicking the can down the road. It's going to, one, make you look like a poor writer, and two, it's going to piss off your audience. You got to resolve something. Ideally, you're resolving your main plot because it's the thing in the book, and you're dangling the character arcs and the subplots because they're easier. I would strongly recommend that you do not leave the main plot of book one unresolved and then bring it into book two thinking that's going to get him engaged, because that just makes you look like a bad writer. I don't care how you're publishing it. That's just a bad narrative move. Yeah, like a romance. So you've got a romance arc between those two characters, right? That can persist over multiple books because it's important, but it's not. Um, it's not like the be all end all. Are cliffhanger endings too frustrating or bad to do? I mean, they're a little from a all right from a reader perspective. A cliffhanger ending is dangerous because you're leveraging the amount of I gotta find out what happens versus the level of satisfaction they already have. So you want to try and like everybody's early move is to constantly cliffhanger. And I've read some web novels, and oh boy, howdy, there. Not everything needs to be a cliffhanger. Not every chapter needs to end with a cliffhanger. Not every paragraph needs to end with a cliffhanger. Holy shit with the cliffhangers. Too many cliffhangers and nothing feels substantial because I just know it's going to be dangled in front of me later. The last sentence of everything is going to be, and then somebody came in the room. And ultimately, what happens is everything turns into one of these over and over and over and over again. And it just stops being, a big deal. So it's not bad to do, but it's one of the, much like an exclamation point, you can do maybe one or two of those before everybody just kind of gets tired of it. What about bringing it in as a subplot? What is the it we are asking about? Bringing what in as a subplot? The problem, like the story's whole problem. But if I resolved it, if I resolved it in book one, I'm only mentioning it in book two as something that happened in the past. Like I successfully made dinner and I'm talking about it because it already happened. So I could reference it, but that doesn't mean it's a subplot again. It just means like I talked about it. Cool. A cliffhanger versus an open ending. The danger with an open ending is that you're totally denying satisfaction and you're sort of like forcing or begging. There's a level of desperation to an open ending where it's like, please, please read my next book, and then I swear you'll get the answers, which is not the most effective way of like guaranteeing readership. If you just wrote a satisfying ending, it'd be fine. Like an open ending for a series ending. Yeah, I mean you can. It's a little it's a little cliche. We've beaten that dead horse pretty dead, but you could do it. If you're worried about like, well, what if I want to pick the story up later? What if like I can't kill everybody off because I might want to revisit it in 2, 3, 5, whatever years? You don't need to have the ending of the book. You don't need to leave it open to pick it up later. Does that make sense? Like if you wrap up the story all nice, neat, and pretty, and everything's all done, you don't need to force the door open so that you want to come back in two books and visit things again. You can just do that. You're in charge. I mean, you're the published author. So, oh, I should point this out because I pointed this out last time and people really appreciated it. If you're a web novel person and you're on, I don't care what platform, you are a self-published author and you've already published. Congratulations, you're a published author. Good for you. There you go. There's your thing. And no, for those people who are going to ask me, if you've whatever you've published on whatever web platform you're on, you can't go shop that to a big five publisher. They will laugh at you. Don't do that. A web novel, it's digital serialization. It doesn't make you an idiot. Web novels are uh, long form storytelling that is chopped into smaller than chapter size pieces and then constantly distributed on a regular schedule. It's what people used to do in the 1800s with magazines, only now they do it on websites. Yeah, short form chapters. That's what they're called. Well, sure, short form, technical term, bite sized, micro chapters, whatever you want to call them. Other things, more meat. So if I'm going to ask you if everybody's okay with your plot, you're totally fine. And I wasted an hour of our day. Is that the conclusion I'm drawing here? See, you use the ellipsis, and that implies like a tone. Ran out of questions. You're writers. Do you want to any recommendations for horror novels, like how to write them, or horror novels you I think you might like? I'd look at early Dean for you. I'd look at early Dean Koontz, like early Dean Koontz, and anything Stephen King wrote when he was on cocaine. I am familiar with the Dan Harmon story circle. Would you like to discuss the Dan Harmon story circle? It's a modified Vogler hero's journey. Suggestions for a good outline. Sure. What would you like to know? Oh, hold up. There we go. Now we're getting questions. Rock and roll. What would you like to know about this Dan Harmon story circle? I like it quite a bit. You think about that. I'm going to keep answering questions. I'm going to come back. Suggestions for a good outline. Whatever method helps you organize story is good. I like note cards. Some people like bullet points. I'm still struggling to find a way to start my story. Do stuff. Have somebody do something. And is enemies to lover a plot? Yeah, enemies to lover is a plot type. Sure. How do you balance between plotting and pantsing? You're new, right? Yeah. Watch all my people jump in here. We don't pants. You're new. Yeah, I know. We don't pants. You don't pants. You're already making no, don't well, fine, but you're putting a ceiling on where you could take your story. You are tying your hands. You are weakening your overall like end goal. You're making it harder for yourself to succeed. You are a child on a carpet playing with toys versus crafting something that can move and inspire another human. You are handicapping yourself. You are hamstringing yourself. We're already doing a level of pantsing when we sit at the keyboard and make the smaller decisions, right? Pantsing's already there. But if you want to go swim in the big ocean with the big books, you got to plot. You got to organize. Make some scenes, make an outline. Whatever kind of outline you want, just do it. We don't pants. And yeah, you could always pants the outline. That's sort of like, yes. I get bored. I'm glad you get bored. That's nice. But you don't have to detail everything. That's just the thing. Like, that's the whole point. No one gives a shit about your outline. Here's a fun publishing fact. No one gives a shit about your outline. The reason why traditional publishers want you to write an outline is just to see if the monkey will jump through the hoops. The two things that you most critically need in traditional publishing is a synopsis and a manuscript, because it gets read by a number of people and not everybody in the room can read the manuscript. So they read the synopsis, and about 50-50 get that split. Nobody gives a shit about the outline. The outline is just there to see if you can tell a whole story. Where's the climax? What's the important part? How does it wrap up? You don't have to detail everything. No one gives a shit about like the color of the shoes is blue. Nah. Just needs to be like a bullet point. Boom, 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 boom. Too often when people think about outlines, they think school, right? Roman numerals, capital letters, little lowercase whatevers. None of that's necessary. In fact, in traditional publishing, we laugh at those authors because, look, they think it's school. It's not. Bullet points are fine. Numbers are fine. Note cards, whatevers, post-it notes. You don't have to detail everything. You just have to know, I'm starting here. This is going to happen. When we do come back when we do scenes next week, and you will see how little you actually need, like written down in advance before we move forward. Hella vague, man. Hella vague outline. But we don't pants. Because we want the structure. Because we want the limitation. Because we want to keep the story moving. And we don't want to wobble. We don't want to weaken the overall structure. And yes, you are the writer. And you can change things whenever you want. Because writing is the act of making decisions. Also, you're the publisher because you're a self-published author. So you can also make the author change things. It's a nice thing about being your own boss. So yeah. Scene question. Does every scene need to address the character's want, or can a scene be more vague or open-ended? Oh, that's a good one. Some scenes can be vague and open-ended. Not every scene, and try not to do that back to back to back. But yeah, you can do some open-ended stuff. That's fine. But most, okay, so the keyword there would be address, because you can try to address a thing and not ultimately do it, but you at least tried. But yeah, you can totally have some vague and open-ended stuff. Just don't do like a lot of that because otherwise it feels unsatisfying. And you got to be a mean boss, but you want to be a writer. Like that's what you want to do. So why would you be mean about this thing that you say is important to you? Just do your best at it. It's your craft. Practice it. Be thrilled with it. Sit your ass in the chair and do it. I find as I'm revising book two, I'm having the same scenes that do the same work, and it's squishy and boring. I was thinking those is updated, but they turned out to be redundant. Yes, that's a thing. So redundancy happens when a scene fails to accomplish anything. When a scene isn't doing something, it doesn't have to be always what the characters want, but it's got to do something. Do slice of life stories need to follow a structure? All stories need structure. Every single one. They don't all need to follow the same structure. Some stories are better told in 5 acts. Some stories are better told in seven. Some are better told in two. But yeah, every story has a structure, including slice of life, where you still have to frame some kind of goal or want for the character and drive them towards it. Even if you're doing like an epistolary, right? Even if you're doing like Dear Diary, um, yeah, you still need to drive the character to something. Well, I do one on pitching. I'd like to. Um, I would definitely like to. Yeah, no worries. Hey, I'm glad you got a plot now. That's awesome. Congratulations. Enjoy. Yeah, I'll do one on pitching. I want to do one on scenes just to organize like people and get them doing things. But I would do one on pitching. Yeah. I do one on I probably do pitching and blurbs together so that because it's more or less the same skill. Just one's bigger than the other. Dad got drunk and fell on the roof. They tried and fell. He just had to sleep on the roof. I guess. Yeah, but I want to do scenes first because it's fun for me and because I think it'll help people and I think it'll break up some of the some of the bad habits. Also, it gives me a chance to talk about beats and most people don't get beats. So I will re explain it. See, that's the thing. Beats are a weak point. Like, but if you can do scenes, scenes contain beats. So if you have a scene, right? Like here we'll do a promo, right? So if you have a scene where well here, Tam, just give me a scene. Tell me a scene in your book. Any scene, doesn't matter. Big giant fight scene between two giant ass robots. Big giant fight scene between two giant ass robots is an action scene because it's a fight between robots. The the scene where two characters argue and then break up is a scene with two dialogue beats because they're two different conversations. We're arguing and then we're breaking up. But it's also a scene with some amount of an emotional beat in it because somebody's feeling feelings. Beats make scenes. There's 5 kinds of beats and a billion different kinds of scenes. And it's just about combining them. Sex scenes. Sex scenes are action scenes or feeling scenes. Emotional scenes. Emotional beats. Not all action scenes, not all action beats are big giant Michael Bay explosions. They're just people doing stuff. But yes, next week we're gonna do beats and we're gonna do scene construction, which is the fancy way of saying beats, scenes, and outlines. Is that the 20th? Now I gotta look at like a thing. Hang on. That's gonna be the 21st. Saturday. Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we will do some administrative stuff and go from there. All right. Who does everybody has one, right? I got everybody. I onboarded a ton of humans last time. Does anybody who let's see, how do I think everybody got one. Last week I gave an invite to the Discord, right? And some people jumped in and have been asking questions and getting help and doing stuff. I think everybody here has that. Possibly. I don't know. No worries. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. All right. So if anybody here, just do it this way. We'll do it one more time. Where's the button? All right. So we close that. We do that. We come over here and copy that. All right. If anybody needs me or has more questions, you can come find me. Why did that not do the thing? Anyway, if anybody needs me or you have any questions or you want to come find me, the easiest place to find me is on Discord. Unless you're a client, then you have like 5 other ways to find me. Any other problems, issues, etc. Else we shall get out of here for the day. Will I post the transcript? Yes, I will do the transcript, and I'm going to stop the button.